Alright, I know this looks bad. Bear with me. We're putting up with some issues, clearing other filming locations. Growing pains, am I right? Honestly, I don't see why you can't just film outside your house. Just saying, we live together anyways. Benedict wouldn't mind the company. And besides, you're really taking this thing. What is that? Don't worry about them. Worry about. Oh, the video. Almost forgot we were doing that. So, I'm gonna be honest. This has been a topic I've wanted to cover even before I decided to take YouTube seriously. You clicked on the video, you know what this is about, so I'll just speed this part along. I feel like the fantasy community is often misinterpreted, misunderstood. It's important here to interject with what I feel constitutes as fantasy in this argument. Obviously, it's a term that's still beholden to that original definition of fictional works that incorporate magical elements, though this can be applied to so many different genres. Science fiction, for example, often intertwines magic and quantitative logic into its stories. But where I distinguish fantasy is when these works disregard technology as a central theme and instead lean fully into magic and make-believe. Think Spirited Away as a baseline example. Or, of course, all the other titles that typically come to mind and which we'll discuss in this video. So, there's a lot to love about these lofty tales of ferocious beasts and woodland creatures and gallant sword-wielding champions and their traveling bard companions and, well, this is just starting to sound like D&D. You see where I'm going with this? When you put some thought into it, it becomes kind of apparent that the fantasy genre is sort of synonymous with certain IPs or worlds that exist in media and literature. I mean, imagine an orc, one of my favorite quote-unquote races in the genre, and I bet you one of these three general depictions come to mind. One is from the aforementioned Dungeons & Dragons franchise, here we have a Tolkien-inspired one, and lastly, World of Warcraft. And before you come at me with the countless other examples out there of differing takes on the concept, can you at least agree that these are by far and away the most prime and universally agreed upon examples of the orc race? Truly, as ancient as these creatures are in fantasy literature, its source material leaves a lot to the reader's imagination. Yet we know that orcs are synonymous with big toothy underbites, wide jaws, a general brutish physique, green skin, and, dare I say, tribal-inspired hair and clothing. There's a bit of a controversy there if you were to stir things. But I'm no saint. I've drawn them in this style myself. But I've also distanced myself quite a bit from that by bringing orcs and other fantasy races into the modern realm, exploring what kinds of roles these stereotypes would play in a civilized, interconnected world. What about orcs as doctors, scholars, physicists, artists, instead of these tanky, bloodthirsty Bruins? Or how about elves? Would they still be these fey, ethereal beings of elevated status? Or can they be messy and grungy? Of course, the argument I'm trying to make isn't one of spotting the negative stereotypes of these literal make-believe races. I'm merely encouraging the discussion of what role these big landmark franchises such as Lord of the Rings has played in sculpting our understanding of the fantasy genre and its themes. In this video, I will go over the distinctions between each of the main fandoms eclipsed by the fantasy genre, and attempt to bridge the gaps between these megalithic empires in hopes to uncover what really drives the fantasy community, as well as scanning the internet to determine if there is in fact a community for it beyond D&D, WoW, or LOTR. Okay, there's going to be a lot of acronym use in this one. Okay, I'm not going to play around here. This video was mainly inspired by the immense foothold Dungeons & Dragons has on fantasy media. That's why I put D&D in the title. My relationship with D&D is kind of weird. I've never really gotten into it or anything, but I do know enough to say this. For someone who is new to the craft of OC design, or original character design, D&D is really a gateway drug. And I'm not using drug lightly here. I've seen countless OCs on places like DeviantArt and Fur Affinity who are basically just the artist's D&D character, or inspired by them at the very least. Some have used that as a baseline to explore said character further, and on that note, pursuing art in general, but the going still stands. And it's this aspect of D&D which I love so much. I mean, there's nothing out there that actively engages a level of creativity quite like this 1980s board game that has withstood the test of time. Understatement of the century, I know. That being said, I do have my gripes and, things I've noticed that have personally soured my feelings with D&D just a little bit. And it goes back to the revolving thesis of this video. Sadly, I do sincerely believe that D&D has contributed a fair bit to the growing level of complacency in the designs and the themes present in the fantasy genre. D&D encourages you to be original, but with the caveat that your character must fit three things: a race, a role, and a background, as dictated by the game's formal yet informal player handbook. Let's talk about roles for a second. It's kind of funny to me that we've gone so deep into D&D that your friend can ask you what kind of fantasy role or class you'd fulfill, without the conversation even being about the game. You have the paladin, the barbarian, the mage, the druid, the cleric, etc., etc. And in most practical instances, these roles make up what is called a party. This is basically just kindergarten in the world of RPG, much less fantasy. But we seem to have stitched the two together as if you can't have one without the other. I digress though, it's fun. I can entirely get behind the nerddom, that was an interesting word to include there, nerddom that these things generate. It's kind of like astrology to me, where we'll often say things like, "God, Erica, you're such a Libra," or "Steven is more warlock than any of us," I guess. Erica and Steven. That sounds believable, right? I don't know. I have no friends. You think I have friends? But it's here where I'm often asking myself, why is this thing so specific to fantasy? What's with this frankly overused theme of a ragtag group of misfits? Am I supposed to believe that this is how things got done in the day? You say, let's go on a quest, and grab your buddies who have the most awkward chemistry between each other, and then set off on this month-long conquest to slay some dragon? Is anyone diplomatically involved here? I'm looking way too deep into it, I know, but I'm only doing so because I care so much. Honestly, and I tell this to about every person I meet, if the fantasy community operated closer to how the furry community does, I'm not sure I would have ever jumped the gun and became a furry myself. These guys you see on the screen wouldn't have ever existed. I wouldn't be down a few $1,000 because I caved and bought myself Wait, why am I telling you this again? Fantasy is deeply ingrained within me, as friends of mine have no doubt observed. There's this back and forth play within my art, in which I always seem to have one hand in the furry paint and the other in fantasy. And as much as this is probably hurting my brand, I really can't help it. My first ever OC was an orc named Wylith. Hell, my first concept of a webcomic was about a couple of gay elves living in the year 2008. It was an interesting time, don't judge. And flash forward to now, I'm still obsessed with drawing these more humanoid characters, like Dexy here.
Who I'm working on in real time because caffeine and Adderall is a delightful combination.
Joking, of course, but some days I really feel what Fry must have felt in that one episode of Futurama. Anyways, I lost the plot again. Let's reel her back in. D&D also, of course, invented and popularized the whole tabletop RPG genre. Which, my gosh, can you even picture a group of fantasy nerds without a game board, character sheets, and a 20-sided custom 3D printed pair of dice in front of them? It's clear to see that D&D not only opened the floodgates, but still stands as the crown jewel of interactive fantasy titles, jousting away all the competition before they could even take a swing. That being said, one particular entry came kind of close. World of Warcraft. What is there to say? WoW revolutionized the fantasy genre by putting their own spin on what we've been talking about, and by doing it so well. It's difficult to overstate how culturally impactful this franchise has been since its launch in 2004. Communities such as DeviantArt would not be the same place without World of Warcraft. If it weren't for WoW, the mention of certain fantasy races such as trolls, goblins, dwarves, etc., would still yield a limited and widely inconsistent image in the minds of many. Additionally, this is one of those modern marvels that would go on to influence generations of video games to come. both on the gameplay side and, as for why we're even here having this discussion, the world building side. When we dissect the timeline of fantasy media and examine all its critical turning points, ranging from Disney making animated feature films based on ancient pagan folklore in the early 20th century, to now in 2024 where this sort of thing is a staple in art and media, I think many of us would find that World of Warcraft was really that catalyst. Hence, it's not difficult to see how the design language of what at this point would be considered standard fantasy races would rival D&D's. But that's just the shallow end of the pool, as when you look deeper, you'll find plenty of other races and, furthermore, classes/roles which are entirely unique to the WoW brand. There's just this enormous amount of material in the base game and subsequent output, even today with yet another major expansion, The War Within, set to release less than a month from now. With all this in mind, I am left wondering if World of Warcraft did give rise to an underground movement in the broader fantasy community, or if it pulled another D&D in which its fandom is exclusivized to the game and its related lore. It's time for some stats. The thing that most intrigued me when doing research for this part of the video was discovering that, as far as WoW-themed cons go, BlizzCon is essentially all there is to talk about. So then I looked into the possibility of there being a more blanketing MMORPG-style convention affair for WoW fans. And the only results I got back were cons for tabletop RPG enthusiasts. I told y'all, D&D is like the Beatles of fandom culture. Okay, I've never uttered that sentence in my life until now. So, upon first glance, you'd think that these results contradict the impact that World of Warcraft brought to the table. But I wouldn't necessarily consider a fandom's affinity to be involved in conventions a viable metric for determining overall cultural significance. Though there definitely is a conversation to be had here regarding the question, so where is everybody? Let's continue investigating as we venture out of gaming and into films and TV. To mix it up, I brought my guest Ike to narrate this segment. I'm literally you. What? And we're back, I guess. To complete our big four-punnet square of fantasy media, I think Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter would go here and here respectively. Yours might look different, but these four IPs are just larger than life at this point, and to my eyes are all characterized well by their equally triumphant impact on fantasy media. At some point, you've probably met an annoying-ass fan of one of these franchises that I've talked about today. Sorry, the content gods told me I need to be a little more unrestrained in these videos. That said, Middle-earth is worth being an absolute snarmy girl boss over. I mean, these designs are peak, and no hero's journey comes close to feeling as immersive as witnessing Frodo's and Bilbo's separate but equally legendary quests on the big screen. I'd say the same for Harry Potter, but controversy has forever tainted this franchise, and I will decline to ever neutrally bring up the subject out of respect for my trans homies. That and Lord of the Rings is just better, fight me in the comments. Overall, these types of franchises do stick out from the others in that they are extremely lore-focused. I mean, these are films and books we're talking about. It goes without saying that there's going to be less leeway in the things fans can come up with, which I guess accurately fit in with the universe and timeline. There's no shortage of Lord of the Rings-inspired characters and whatnot on the internet, but is it a breeding ground of creativity for fans to take fully advantage of? I would argue no on that. This is why I chose to bring Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter into the picture last. But they are certainly not the only titles that have made a name for themselves in the fantasy community and are worth mentioning. Others I'd include are League of Legends, Skyrim, Elden Ring, Percy Jackson, Jim Henson Projects, Neverending Story, Studio Ghibli, Final Fantasy. I mean, from that list I just named, sure there's a uniting theme in them all sharing the fantasy tag, I guess you could say. But what I think of first when I see these titles is that they each have their own fandom to answer to. Put a member of each in a room and it'll be one of the most socially awkward, funny, and maybe even heated experiences they'd ever partake in. Things are beginning to look a little bleak here. What does a dedicated fantasy convention actually look like? Well, it's kind of hard to say, given there are practically no perfect examples out there in the real world. Let me expand upon what I mean by perfect. There seems to be no end in sight when it comes to these cons that advertise to general fans of sci-fi comics, anime, video games, and fantasy, but as a full package experience. And don't get me started on how many tabletop role-playing conventions there are out there. Now, I'm not saying I'm interested in gatekeeping and pigeonholing the fantasy lovers into their own faction, but its own dedicated convention space would be kinda cool. A breath of fresh air. There are a couple cons that stick out to me for coming close to offering this experience. There's Dragon Con, which I'm sure a few of you have heard of. And then there's Conjuration, a smaller but more explicitly fantasy-focused venue. Why both happen to be located in the Atlanta area? I don't know. And I couldn't wrap things up without mentioning LARPing, which is an activity most commonly organized by fantasy fans. So I will say, if you ever want to meet those who are fans purely of the fantasy genre and aesthetic, showing up to LARP fests is probably your best bet. Though this being the most accessible way to engage in the culture is kind of telling if you ask me. Like, I might be the odd one out here for having such a specific appreciation for fantasy as far as my definition of it goes. It is entirely possible that the majority of fantasy fans are also fans of all these other things, and that the best commercial approach to expanding their interest into the real world, on location, is to just group everything together. Con attendance is kind of tribulatory at the end of the day. I mean, no more is that apparent than in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. At least, as of now, it's just a better move to lure in as many attendees as possible, generally speaking. But in the future, when and if cons blow up to the point where there's a clear oversaturation problem, I predict that many con organizers will try to market their events to specific sub-communities. Maybe then my dream of a pure fantasy-themed convention will finally happen. One complete with dragons, royalty, mythical creatures, and things. Look, I'm a giant nerd underneath whatever this facade is, okay? No, they got that, I think. This one has been a bit all over the place, but if you recall, my objective was to explore if there existed enough of a genuine fantasy community to consider it a fandom. And if not, why that might be. I really wasn't sure where my research would take me while embarking upon this video essay, but the fact that I even wanted to cover this topic proves that I at least drew some inspiration from thoughts and feelings I've had growing up on the internet and seeing firsthand the lack of organization within the fantasy circle, if you can even draw one. And my hunches were correct for the most part. For most fans of fantasy-related stuff, there just isn't a necessity to separate the genre from the existing fandoms that celebrate it. What I mean is, unlike the furry fandom, which gives a platform to the genre itself, not enough people seem to want that with fantasy. I mean, sure, like, who out there would want to make a goblin sona when you've got all these options? I mean, I would. But I can see why there's a lack of appeal, no matter how fire these more humanoid avatars look. In fact, if there were an actual fantasy fandom like the one I've been conjuring up in my head, I think it would operate closer to the anime fandom, where it's more about the aesthetics and the big shonen series than anything. Like, fantasy has its own celebrated works, as we've discussed in length by now, but what fantasy lacks, in making this comparison, is the existence of a fandom culture surrounding it, in my eyes. Anime has otakus. Fantasy has... Anime has a dedicated convention scene. Once again, fantasy has... I don't know, the two just feel very different to me. Like, I remember when I first learned about the common anime trope of nosebleeds, where there's that whole tsundere thing. Tsundere. Yeah. And it's that stuff which just makes the anime community what it is. I guess one could make the argument that fantasy has its share of dumb memed upon things, such as everything having quote-unquote stats, like a level 1 toilet paper roll as a weapon, or a common sock as a piece of armor, you know? That seems to be a trope common in fantasy regardless of where it began. How did I get on this tangent? So I guess I wouldn't rule out the possibility that somehow after all this research, I'm still just an uninformed observer. Maybe there's a horde, if you will, of fantasy fanatics out there ready to dismantle my claims in the comment section, which I will gladly encourage. Do so as you will. But as far as my own speculation goes, I think I've arrived at the answer I set out to find. Phew, if my voice sounds a little coarse by now, you know why. I hope this was a worthwhile exploration into the topic of the fantasy genre and its fandom culpability. I'm probably going to take a bit of a break from these super meta discussions surrounding fan culture and, brand science. Down at the sites, my focus will likely shift a little towards reviewing and promoting some of the latest indie projects that are taking over the internet by storm. I've got some comics I've been really wanting to shout out in their own dedicated videos. This channel is, of course, still very young, so bear with me as I fool around and figure out a content stream that works for me and for you guys. My number one goal will always be to deliver something of value to you. Beautiful you, who stuck around to the end. Thank you, my dude. Alright, big cheers as always. Don't forget to appreciate the little things, give your pet some loves, go on walks, that kind of stuff. Mark, out.